Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Ready for a deep dive today? We're taking on a giant, a legal giant, that is, Thurgood Marshall.
Ooh, I like it. Giant of the law, exactly.
And you brought this great episode of Mr. Hutchings History to guide us.
That's a good one.
Yeah, and it really gets into, his fight for civil rights and his incredible, just legal mind.
It's a masterclass, really. Using the law to fight for justice.
Right, and how it still, echoes today, what he did.
Absolutely.
And what I found really interesting is, we all think Brown v. Board of Education, but it didn't start there, did it? He was making change long before that.
Well, right, and the podcast starts with this case, Murray v. Pearson, back in 1935, where he challenged segregation at the University of Maryland's law school.
Wow, 1935.
Yes, he was a young lawyer with the NAACP at this point, and he won.
So this is almost 20 years before Brown v. Board.
Exactly.
Wow, okay, that's what, it wasn't just like, oh, suddenly, this was a long game.
This is strategy, right? This early case, it's like he's not just, fighting individual battles here. He's going after separate but equal at its roots.
It's like he's playing chess, everyone else is playing checkers.
Yes. And you see this even more with the cases between Murray and Brown. We're talking Missouri ex rel, Gaines v. Canada, Sweat v. Painter, all these huge wins for equal access to education.
But also, like you said, these stepping stones.
Building that foundation. Each case chipping away at separate but equal, building momentum, setting those precedents.
Brick by brick. But you know what really struck me, and maybe this is just me, but it wasn't just the law. He brought in this human element. The podcast talks about his use of Professor Kenneth Clark's research, specifically those doll tests.
Oh, powerful, powerful stuff. You show a child two dolls, one white, one black. You ask, which one is the good one? Which one is smarter? Which one would you rather play with? And the results, they were heartbreaking.
Heartbreaking, but it makes it real,
It showed the damage segregation was doing to children, their self-esteem, their sense of self-worth. And Marshall saw that. He recognized the power of that evidence, not just legal arguments, but the human cost.
Right, the human cost. This was real people's lives. This wasn't just some abstract legal thing anymore.
Exactly.
And I think that's what's just, wow.
Powerful
Stuff.
The court couldn't ignore that. They couldn't ignore those children.
And then, that takes us to, it's kind of like the case, right? Brown v. Board of Education.
It's huge.
You really, when you're reading about it, you feel the weight of what that case meant.
Oh, absolutely. 1954, the Supreme Court says segregation in public schools, it's unconstitutional, it's over. That's a landmark victory.
Huge.
A turning point.
It's easy to think, okay, well, that's it then, right? But it's not.
Right, because, changing the law.
Changing how people act, changing hearts and minds.
It's a process. It's not just a switch you flip on.
And the podcast talks about, the resistance Marshall faced even after Brown v. Board.
Oh, massive resistance. Some states were literally trying to defy the Supreme Court.
Wow.
Can you imagine? The courage to keep fighting when people are just, outright refusing.
Refusing to follow the law. And I think that really speaks to Marshall, his dedication. This wasn't just about winning a case in court. This was about, like you said, changing the country.
Fundamental change.
Yeah, and the podcast specifically mentions Cooper v. Aaron in 1958. What was that about again, just to remind?
So Cooper v. Aaron, that was about reaffirming that federal law is supreme. States can't just ignore the Supreme Court.
They were trying to.
They tried. But Marshall and his team, they shut it down.
Wow.
It shows how deeply ingrained, segregation was in certain places that they would go to these lengths to fight it.
To fight against equality.
Exactly. And it also shows how important it was to keep fighting for enforcement.
Oh.
It wasn't enough to win in court. You had to make sure those victories meant something in the real world.
That's what I'm saying. Laws changing, that's one thing. But people, beliefs, it's a process.
Yeah, it takes time.
And Marshall, he understood that.
He was in it for the long haul.
Yeah, and his influence, it wasn't just in the courtroom. The podcast talks about how he became Solicitor General under President Johnson. So now he's what? Arguing for the government?
For the government before the Supreme Court. He went from arguing against the government to being the lawyer for the entire United States.
That's wild.
It's quite a journey.
And then, of course, 1967, first African-American Supreme Court justice.
Incredible, yeah. Think about what that must have felt like, the weight of that moment, the hopes he must have carried.
The hopes of so many people.
A symbol of how far we'd come as a nation.
But also how far we still had to go, right?
Exactly.
It makes you think, if he could accomplish all that, Facing down those challenges, what are we capable of? What are our bricks, as the podcast says?
It's a good question, and I think this episode gives us some answers. It shows us that change requires action, it requires persistence, a willingness to stand up for what's right.
Even when it's hard.
Especially when it's hard. Marshall, he wasn't afraid to challenge the status quo, to push for better, to use the law to make a difference.
And we can do that too. It's easy to get, kind of overwhelmed thinking about these huge figures in history and think, well, I could never do that.
Right. They seem larger than life.
But that's what I liked about this podcast. It really, breaks it down.
Makes it relatable.
Yeah. It wasn't like, oh, he was just brilliant. It was, he worked hard. He had a strategy. He didn't give up.
He had setbacks. He had people against him. He just kept going.
Exactly. And that's, no matter what you're doing, that's a good lesson.
Absolutely. Whatever your battle is, right? Keep fighting the good fight.
And find your brick, right? Like the podcast says.
Yeah.
What's that thing you can do? Speak up, learn about something, support a cause. I don't know.
It all matters.
Yeah.
Every little bit adds up.
Because this idea of change just happening, it's not real, is it? It takes work. It takes all of us.
And I think, that was really at the heart of what Marshall understood. His fight wasn't just about him. It was about everyone. It was about equal education, fair treatment, a world where everyone has a chance to succeed.
And that fight, it's still going on today, isn't it? This podcast, it wasn't just like, oh, interesting history. It felt like, okay, what can I do?
A call to action.
Yeah. To be better, more engaged.
Just like Thurgood Marshall.
So to everyone listening, really, as you're going about your day, think about him, his fight, his brilliance, his belief that things could be better, more just, and ask yourself, what's your brick?
What a great question to end on.
What's that thing, big or small, that you can do to help build that world he was fighting for?
Where equality and justice aren't just words, they're reality.
That's it for our deep dive into the incredible life and legacy of Thurgood Marshall. Thanks for diving deep with us. We'll be back next time with another fascinating topic, and as always, ready to unpack it all with you.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.